Many of us likely think that humans are everywhere on this planet. There are billions of us, and it often feels like wherever you look, there are people, leaving no wild or unexplored places in the world. But that's simply not true. The world is a huge place, and there are still areas as remote and untouched as they were thousands of years ago. So just how far can you get from every other human being on the planet? For a bit of excitement, let's imagine you were teleported to some of these remote locations and think about how, or if, you'd manage to escape. Maybe you'd want to be near a few people but far away from everyone else. In that case, you might like to visit Tristan da Cunha, the most remote inhabited island in the world. This tiny island has a population of just 264 people, and while you're there, the closest population would be 2,000 kilometers away on the island of St. Helena, which is itself quite remote. The nearest continent to you would be Africa, at a staggering distance of 2,400 kilometers. There's no airport on the island, so the only way to get in or out is by boat. And those boats only come from South Africa around 8 or 9 times a year. If you really wanted to leave the island, you'd better have your own boat. And even then, the shortest trip to the nearest airport on Ascension Island would take you about 7 days. In addition to Tristan da Cunha, another extremely remote inhabited island is Pitcairn Island in the South Pacific. It's one of the most isolated places on Earth, with a population of only about 50 people, all of whom are descendants of the famous mutineers from the HMS Bounty and their Tahitian companions. Pitcairn's isolation has led to a fascinating history of self-reliance and solitude. Getting to the island is extremely challenging, as there are no airports or large enough ports to accommodate regular commercial ships. The only way to travel to Pitcairn is by cargo ships, which visit the island just a few times a year. The nearest inhabited city, Tahiti, is about 2,000 kilometers away, meaning the residents of Pitcairn live in near complete isolation, with rare contact with the outside world. Now, imagine you're dropped in the center of Devon Island, part of the Canadian archipelago. This island is roughly the size of Croatia, but there's not a single person living on it. No one. It's just you and absolute solitude, with no one around to help. The nearest population would be on the neighboring island, in the town of Resolute, which has just 229 people, and that's the only settlement in the area. But even then, that town is 80 kilometers away from the island you're on, and you'd need a boat to reach it. You might think the South Pole is one of the most remote and distant places in the world. While that was true in the past, today the South Pole hosts a permanent research station with up to 150 scientists living there at any given time. A much more remote and difficult place to reach in Antarctica, however, is this spot here, the farthest point from the ocean on the continent. It's located 878 kilometers from the research station at the South Pole, which would be the closest inhabited place to you. It might bring some relief to know that there's a pre-built shelter at this spot, though most of it is buried under the snow. The Soviets reached this location back in 1958 and erected a bust of Lenin facing Moscow, which is the only thing still standing today, gazing out over the vast emptiness in every direction. The last time humans visited this point was in 2011, so unless you want to wait years for rescue, you'd better start heading toward the South Pole Research Station. However, this is not the most remote piece of land on Earth. That title belongs to Bouvet Island, located in the South Atlantic. It's a small, frozen island completely uninhabited by humans, though Norway claims it for some unknown reason. The nearest land to you would be Queen Maud Land, along the coast of Antarctica, about 1,660 kilometers away. But that's also uninhabited, so heading there wouldn't help. The closest humans would be 2,260 kilometers away on Tristan da Cunha, which, as we've discussed before, is itself extremely remote. For reference, that distance is about 54% of the way from the west coast of the US to the east coast, with no other humans in sight. And that's just to get to the most remote inhabited place on Earth, which, as mentioned, doesn't even have an airport and only receives boats 8 or 9 times a year. So far, we've only talked about being on land, but we haven't yet considered the ocean. If we set aside distance and focus on the obstacles between you and any other person, then the bottom of the Mariana Trench, nearly 11 kilometers below the ocean's surface, would be an incredibly solitary place. Only 3 people have ever been to the bottom throughout human history, and the last time was in 2012. Strangely enough, that means 4 times as many people have walked on the moon as have reached the bottom of the ocean. But let's go back to distance for a moment, because the ocean is truly vast and far larger than most of us realize. For example, this point in the Arctic Ocean is the farthest point in that ocean from any land. It's located on a moving ice floe, so building any permanent structure is impossible. If you manage to reach this point, the closest inhabited land would be Ellesmere Island in Canada, home to just 146 people. The nearest settlement on that island, Grise Fjord, would be 1,638 kilometers away from you at this point. No one has ever reached this spot in history, so if you want to become an explorer and have your name written in the history books alongside the greats, set out and be the first to get there. In the heart of the Himalayas, there's a place known as the Pole of Inaccessibility for air routes, considered the most distant point from commercial flight paths. Situated at an altitude of approximately 5,200 meters, this spot is incredibly remote, with extreme weather conditions and challenging geography. Very few mountaineers have access to this isolated area due to the altitude and the difficulty of navigation. Surrounded by towering peaks and vast landscapes of snow and ice, this point in the Himalayas exemplifies how inaccessible and inhospitable our planet can still be, even with modern advancements in transportation technology. And finally, the most terrifying and remote place you could ever reach, far away from the rest of humanity, lies in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. On a globe, the Pacific seems to take up nearly half of everything you see. This exact spot, known as Point Nemo, is by far the most remote location on Earth. The nearest inhabited land from here would be Easter Island, a staggering 2,689 kilometers away. To put that in perspective, that's about 64% of the distance from the west coast of the United States to the east coast, with not a single other person in sight. Just a vast, empty ocean all around you. If you're thinking that perhaps shipping routes or cargo ships pass by here and could come to your rescue, take a look at a map of these commercial routes. Notice the dark areas around, not just here, but also in the Arctic Ocean and around Bouvet Island, which we discussed earlier. The fastest time anyone has ever reached Point Nemo by boat took an astonishing 15 days, 10 hours, and 37 minutes. Just to get there, not counting the time to return. It's bizarre to think that if you were sitting here alone on a boat, the nearest humans to you would be the astronauts aboard the International Space Station as they occasionally orbit the Earth above you. The station orbits at a maximum altitude of 416 kilometers above the Earth's surface, which is much closer than the 2,689 kilometers you would need to travel to reach Easter Island. In fact, the space station would be the nearest humans to you in many of the other remote locations we've discussed as well, but especially here. If you were stranded, the astronauts would be far too distant to help, and the fastest possible way anyone could reach you would still take more than 15 days. The closest assistance you could hope for would be equivalent to traveling nearly 2/3 of the way across the United States. A sobering thought when considering how truly isolated you'd be.